Why did what got China to that point where they decided that they needed to buy or wanted to approach Smithfield?
Well, there's multiple incidents in China's history that have led to that. I mean, I think going far back along that timeline, of course, it's the Great Famine, when I think the sort of mainstream estimates are 37 million people died in China, um, in 59 to 61, if I'm remembering the dates off the top of my head. Um, Basically, inside China, they'll call it the years of natural disaster, but it was government policy that pushed forward an agenda that didn't work and screwed up their agricultural system and left them lacking adequate food supplies. And so the current leadership of China, like Xi Jinping and others, remember a time of deep, dark deprivation where there wasn't enough food and people, and you have to think that if 37 million people actually um, succumbed to death as a result of malnourishment, that meant there were 100 million plus people that were along that same path. So it would have been a really horrible time. And they remember that. And then they begin to look around and they see that there is growing prosperity in their country. I mean, China's economic rise has been amazing. And I think one of the important things here is also that one of the greatest achievements of the 20th century was that in a couple decades, China pulled 400 million people out of extreme poverty. 400 million people, I mean, talk about results.
Yeah.
Um, but one of the issues that then comes up is if you have more middle class, and I think China now has the world's largest middle class, you have more people that can afford to eat what food economists will say up the food chain, but really they just mean meat. So you now have more people that can afford to eat meat. And meat requires a lot of grain, a lot of livestock feed, soy, corn, that requires a lot of land, that requires a lot of water. And China doesn't have enough water to grow enough food to meet that rising demand. And there have just been increasing indications in the global marketplace that the world is teetering on not actually being able to meet that demand for countries. And there was a guy, Lester Brown, who in the late 90s wrote a book called Who Will Feed China? And Lester worked within the US government, and then went on to an academic career and is just a widely celebrated agroeconomist. And when that book came out, that rattled the Chinese government enough to actually officially release a statement denouncing his book. And as he tells it, to send hecklers, as he was touring around universities talking about it. They would plant hecklers in the audience. And truth be told, and now I've talked to people who Chinese folks that have looked into it and researched this. It was that book that really woke up the Chinese government, and they began, as the Chinese government can do, taking really rapid action to solve this. And that meant directly buying and controlling food and water resources around the world. And I think now most other nations, especially wealthy nations, have woken up to this reality. Our government, the ODNI, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, did an intelligence community assessment in 2012 on water. And that's like the highest intelligence product our government does, where they pull in the CIA and the DIA and the various intelligence communities to do this very thorough intelligence assessment on water. And the whole backstory on how it was that they ended up doing that report is pretty astounding, because they were initially resistive to it. And by the time they were finished with it, as Major General Richard Engel said, mea culpa, this is a top line national security issue. And so I think other governments have really, and then the Arab Spring, I'm kind of jumping around now.
Yeah. Well, they're
But I
all
think the Arab
intertied.
Spring, exactly. And I think the Arab Spring really proved the Chinese decision correctly, and started pushing other countries to catch up as when these droughts and grain shortages around the world in kind of 2009 to 2012 time period where food prices really spiked. You saw a bunch of Middle Eastern and North African countries that couldn't afford to continue to subsidize grain imports at the levels they had, which meant that they then had to begin raising prices on food items, basic food items like bread, and populations that were already upset with their governments over mismanagement and probably perceptions of corruption and other issues. I think we all get it's just humans. It's just like a basic level. If you can't feed your kids or you can't feed yourself, but probably especially if you can't feed your kids, you get to a point of just being like, well, all right, let's go. It's go time.
It's the famous quote, "The nine meals from anarchy."
That's right. And you saw a lot of governments topple throughout the Middle East and in North Africa. Um, and after that moment, I think that was really the moment where countries went from being like, yeah, theoretically that seems smart, you should be buying up food and water resources around the world, to being like, we are going to spend huge amounts of money to begin to buy up food and water resources around the world.
The Smithfield purchase by China. When did you realize that you were going to follow that thread and build something into what became the Grab? Because they are connected, but like you said, you found the Smithfield or somebody presented to it first. The Grab is, I'll let you describe it, but if you could explain to me how it kind of grew and then what it became and what it is.
Yeah, The Grab is a feature-length documentary directed by Gabriela Cowperthwaite, who did Blackfish about SeaWorld about a decade ago, and then went on to do scripted movies in Hollywood with Casey Affleck and Jason Segel and Dakota Fanning Johnson. Shit, sorry. I don't know Hollywood very well, so I'm not going
Nor
to
do
rattle
I.
off actors' names. Yeah. So, but an incredible director. And she and I, so it's a feature length documentary directed by Gabriella, and it premiered last year at the Toronto International Film Festival. And we're really hoping that it's going to be in theaters and available widely beginning next year. It takes a look at the national security and global security implications really through a lens of the Defense Department and intelligence communities and Wall Street, of what exactly is beginning to happen with the world's food and water supply. And because there's really no substitute for us as a species if we don't have food and water, like
Yeah.
there is if we don't have oil, or if we don't have the minerals necessary for for battery capacity. It gets really scary really fast. And so that's what it is. It's a deep dive into looking at how this isn't going to theoretically play out, but unfortunately how it's already playing out here in the U.S. Places like Arizona, where I broke the story about Saudi Arabia buying 15 square miles of arid desert land to tap into the aquifer, or going into Africa, where large corporations are beginning to buy up huge tracts of land and displace the local communities that had relied on that for their food and their water, which is just a recipe for conflict.
Yeah.
Um, that folks like that had come with your professional background all too often get called in to then have to deal with. And I think a lot of people in the DoD and the intelligence community say this is preventable. We don't have to be seeding conflict that will then, be fires we then have to deal with and put out in the future. And so I think it's taking a look at the issues through that lens and not an environmental lens, which I think is often what issues around food and water get wrapped up in. But it's really looking at it through a national security lens.